He had always loved the quiet mornings on his land. The sun would rise slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Birds would chirp softly as he walked through the small trail near the edge of his property, coffee in hand, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. It was his space, his little corner of peace away from the busyness of the world. He had worked hard for it, saved up every penny, and every inch of that land carried memories, sweat, and small victories. This was more than just a piece of property. It was his sanctuary. But that morning, the peaceful start was shattered. As he drove down the familiar dirt road toward his land, he noticed something unusual. A massive structure had appeared overnight. A gate, tall and imposing, blocking the entrance completely. Bright signs with bold letters warned him against entering. Access restricted, one sign read. Violation of HOA rules. He slowed the car, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. How could this happen? He had always followed the rules, always paid his dues, and never caused any trouble. He had neighbors who were friendly, and he had always been careful to maintain the property according to community guidelines. Yet there it was, a physical barrier placed in front of him, as if to say he no longer had the right to step onto his own land. Stepping out of the car, he walked closer, examining the gate. The wood was fresh, paint still wet in some places. It looked more threatening than functional. Whoever had built it wanted him to feel fear and helplessness. But instead of backing down, his heart began to race with a different emotion, anger mixed with disbelief. How dare they try to intimidate him this way? He noticed the HOA signs posted all around the gate, detailing supposed violations. Most of them were technical, small points that he had never been informed about. Some of the wording was vague, almost confusing, as if written to sound official but with no real substance. It was clear that the HOA wanted to create a sense of authority, but the lack of communication and suddenness of the action only fueled his frustration. He tried calling the HOA immediately. Ring after ring, he left messages explaining that he had always followed the rules and asking for clarification. But no one answered. Emails were sent, each one polite but firm, demanding a response. Days passed and still there was nothing. The silence felt like a trap, like the HOA was hoping he would either give up or make a mistake that could be used against him. Walking around the gate, he realized that it wasn't just a physical blockade. It was a statement, an assertion of control. The HOA had stepped into a role they were not meant to hold. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power. And now it was personal. The fact that neighbors were watching added another layer of pressure. Some peeked from behind curtains, whispering about what had happened, their curiosity tinged with caution. Others avoided eye contact, unsure if they should intervene or simply stay out of it. As he examined the property from the outside, memories flooded back. He remembered the first time he stepped onto the land, the sense of freedom it gave him. He recalled the weekends spent planting trees and building small paths, the evenings watching the sunset with friends who had come to help. All those memories seemed to be held hostage by the gate. It was more than inconvenience, it was an affront to every effort he had made to create a place of solace. The man spent hours documenting everything. He took photos of the gate from different angles, capturing the freshly painted signs, the nails sticking out, and the uneven boards. He recorded videos walking around the perimeter, narrating the situation for his own records. Every detail was important. He knew that someday this documentation could be crucial if things escalated legally. But even as he did this, he felt a growing determination. He wasn't going to let a few people with official titles dictate what he could or could not do on his own land. The following days were tense. Each morning, he drove down to the gate hoping to see a response from the HOA, some acknowledgement that they were willing to discuss the matter. Each morning, disappointment met him. Sometimes he saw workers from the HOA near the gate, seemingly maintaining it or just standing idly. Their presence felt like a taunt. Yet the man refused to be intimidated. He began noticing patterns. The times when the gate was unattended, the direction the HOA representatives would come from, even the slight gaps in the fence that could be exploited if needed. It was subtle, and he kept it to himself, careful not to give away his thoughts. Neighbors started talking among themselves. A few approached him, expressing sympathy and frustration at the HOA's actions. They shared stories of minor disputes and arbitrary decisions that had gone unchallenged for years. Others were skeptical, warning him not to escalate the situation, suggesting that fighting the HOA could lead to endless legal battles. But he knew that backing down was not an option. This wasn't just about rules or property. It was about standing up for what was right and not letting intimidation dictate his life. He began to reflect on his own feelings during those tense days. Anger was natural, but it wasn't enough. He needed clarity, a plan, and patience. Reacting impulsively could play into the HOA's hands, giving them the reason to escalate the conflict further. So he balanced his emotions with careful observation. He walked around the property at different times of day, noting how the light fell on the gate, listening for sounds that might indicate activity behind it, and mentally mapping the land beyond the blockade. It was during one of these walks that he noticed something subtle yet important. The gate, for all its size and appearance, wasn't as solid as it seemed. Certain areas looked hastily put together, boards slightly misaligned, gaps that suggested it could be bypassed without breaking anything. It wasn't a vulnerability he could exploit immediately, but it planted a seed of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the insurmountable obstacle the HOA wanted it to be. Despite the stress and uncertainty, he also found small moments of calm. Sitting by a nearby tree sipping his coffee, he reminded himself of why he had worked so hard for this land in the first place. It wasn't about conflict or confrontation. It was about the sense of freedom, the connection with nature, and the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. This perspective helped him stay grounded, preventing frustration from turning into despair. Evenings brought their own challenges. The thought of the gate looming in his mind kept him awake, imagining all the ways the HOA could tighten control, or imagining himself finally reclaiming access. Sleep was restless, but his resolve strengthened with each passing day. He wasn't going to let a few hastily constructed boards and threatening signs erase everything he had worked for. He also started thinking about the bigger picture. The HOA's actions were arbitrary, but they reflected a larger issue. Sometimes authority could overstep, and ordinary people had to assert their rights calmly and intelligently. He realized that patience and careful observation were his greatest tools, at least for now. Reacting out of anger could create new problems, but a well-thought-out plan could turn the situation around. As the days stretched into a week, he noticed subtle changes. The HOA representatives seemed to be watching more closely, perhaps noticing his persistence. A few neighbors hinted that they had seen him moving around, taking notes and recording videos. He knew that the HOA might try to catch him making a misstep, but he refused to be intimidated. Every step he took was deliberate, every action calculated. By the end of the first week, he had a clearer understanding of the situation. The gate was more than just wood and nails. It was a symbol of control, but it wasn't invincible. His determination to regain access grew stronger. He knew that reclaiming his land would require careful planning, patience, and a bit of creativity. But one thing was certain: he would not let a fake gate and an overreaching HOA define what he could do on the land he had worked so hard to own. That first week set the stage for everything that would come next. It tested his patience, his resolve, and his intelligence. The peaceful mornings he loved had been disrupted, but the experience ignited a spark within him. He was no longer just a homeowner. He was someone standing up against unnecessary authority, learning to navigate obstacles without losing his calm or his dignity. The gate might have blocked the road, but it could not block his determination. And deep down, he knew that the surprise waiting beyond that fake gate would soon reveal itself, changing everything he thought he knew about the conflict and about the people behind it. Days passed and the man's frustration grew. Every morning he would drive up to the gate, hoping to see some sort of response from the HOA, but each day brought the same sight: the tall, imposing structure blocking his entrance, signs warning him not to enter, and the quiet, watchful presence of the neighborhood. It felt like a trap, a reminder that the people in charge were willing to use intimidation to assert control. Despite this, he refused to let anger rule his actions. He knew he needed patience, careful thought, and strategy if he wanted to reclaim what was rightfully his. He began documenting everything in detail: photos of the gate from different angles, videos narrating the situation, and written notes about the dates and times of his encounters with the HOA. Every detail mattered, and he wanted to create a record that could be used if legal action became necessary. But more importantly, the documentation helped him maintain clarity, preventing emotions from clouding his judgment. At the same time, he started observing the neighborhood more closely. Some neighbors were curious but distant, watching silently from behind curtains or over fences. A few offered advice, warning him about the risks of challenging the HOA too aggressively. Others sympathized, sharing their own stories of minor disputes with the HOA that had been brushed aside. These conversations, though brief, gave him insight into the dynamics at play. It became clear that the HOA wielded power through fear rather than fairness, relying on people's hesitation to challenge authority. He also began noticing patterns in the HOA's behavior. The people monitoring the gate seemed to arrive at predictable times. Sometimes the gate was unattended for long stretches, and the signs, though meant to intimidate, appeared hastily put up. Small gaps in the woodwork, slight misalignments in the boards, and overlooked spaces hinted that the barrier might be more symbolic than effective. These observations planted a seed of hope. Perhaps the obstacle wasn't as insurmountable as it seemed. Evenings were the hardest. He would sit on the porch of a nearby rented cabin, coffee in hand, thinking about the gate and what it represented. Memories of past weekends spent tending the land came flooding back. The planting of trees, the construction of small paths, the quiet nights under a sky full of stars. All of it now felt overshadowed by the sudden confrontation. It was more than a physical blockade. It was an attack on his peace of mind, his sense of ownership, and his connection to the land he loved. Despite the emotional toll, he remained focused. He knew that reacting impulsively could give the HOA the justification they needed to escalate their actions, so he balanced his anger with careful observation. He studied the land from different angles, noted the positions of cameras or any signs of surveillance, and thought about how he might approach the situation safely and effectively. Every step had to be deliberate, every action measured. He also spent time researching the rules and regulations that the HOA cited in their notices. Many of them were vague, written in a way that sounded official but lacked clarity. Some seemed outdated, irrelevant, or selectively enforced. This reinforced his belief that the gate was less about actual violations and more about asserting dominance. He began drafting potential responses, letters that were firm yet respectful, challenging the HOA's claims and requesting clarification. But deep down, he knew that paper alone might not resolve the immediate issue. Conversations with sympathetic neighbors became more meaningful. One neighbor, who had quietly observed the situation, hinted at ways to document the HOA's actions more effectively. Another shared insights about the HOA's routines, without encouraging confrontation, but offering valuable information that could help him plan. These small exchanges reminded him that he wasn't completely alone in facing an organization that relied on fear. During this period, he also confronted his own emotions. The frustration was intense at times, mingling with worry about potential legal repercussions. But he reminded himself that fear could not dictate his actions. His connection to the land, his sense of fairness, and his long-term plan were more important than immediate emotional satisfaction. He practiced patience, knowing that careful observation and strategic planning would ultimately be more effective than rash decisions. As the days turned into a week and then two, he began mapping the land beyond the gate. Walking the perimeter, he identified the strengths and weaknesses of the barrier. The gate was tall and wide, yes, but the construction was not flawless. There were gaps, slightly misaligned boards in areas that had not been secured properly. Even the signage designed to appear threatening seemed hastily arranged. These details gave him a sense of possibility, a glimmer of hope that access could be regained without confrontation or damage. Simultaneously, he thought about timing. Observing the HOA representatives, he noticed predictable patterns, the times they arrived, the directions they came from, and even moments when they were distracted. Knowledge of these routines would be crucial if he wanted to approach the gate safely and reclaim access without triggering unnecessary conflict. It wasn't about sneaking past anyone or breaking rules. It was about understanding the environment and acting with intelligence. In quieter moments, he reflected on the larger lessons of the experience. Authority could overreach, and ordinary people sometimes had to assert their rights calmly and intelligently. His situation was frustrating, even infuriating, but it was also a lesson in patience, observation, and strategic thinking. He began to see the obstacle not just as a physical barrier, but as a test of resilience and resourcefulness. Even as he planned, he maintained his daily routines as much as possible. Early morning walks along the edge of his property reminded him of why he had chosen this place. The connection to nature, the sense of ownership, and the memories embedded in the land were too valuable to be overshadowed completely by the gate. These moments of calm helped him stay grounded, preventing frustration from turning into despair. He also began to imagine the moment he would finally regain access. It wasn't about revenge or confrontation. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully his and restoring peace of mind. The anticipation of that moment became a quiet motivation, guiding his observations and decisions. Each day of frustration was a step toward eventual triumph, a reminder that patience and careful planning could achieve what brute force could not. Neighbors' reactions continued to vary. Some were supportive, expressing admiration for his persistence. Others remained cautious, wary of potential conflict. These interactions reinforced the reality that community dynamics were complex and that every action had consequences. Yet he remained focused on his goal, understanding that public perception was secondary to reclaiming control of his own property. During this period, he also considered the emotional impact of the situation. The sudden blockade was stressful, but it also revealed a deeper resilience within him. He realized that facing unjust obstacles could strengthen determination and encourage creative problem-solving. This insight gave him a sense of empowerment, turning frustration into motivation rather than despair. By the end of the second week, he had a detailed understanding of the situation. The gate was symbolic, the HOA's power reliant on intimidation, and the land beyond it was still his. He had observed patterns, documented actions, and considered multiple approaches to reclaiming access safely. The frustration remained, but it was tempered by clarity, planning, and the knowledge that the obstacle, while imposing, was not insurmountable. In those quiet evenings, as he sat sipping coffee and looking toward the blocked entrance, he felt a growing sense of purpose. The situation was challenging, yes, but it was also an opportunity to demonstrate patience, intelligence, and determination. He was learning to navigate obstacles not through force, but through careful observation, planning, and understanding of human behavior. The second part of this experience reinforced a vital lesson. Frustration alone could not resolve the problem, but careful thought, persistence, and strategic planning could. Every photo, every note, and every observation brought him closer to a solution. And with each passing day, he became more confident that the gate, impressive as it seemed, would not define the outcome. The journey was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that his patience and determination were his greatest allies. After 2 weeks of careful observation and planning, he began to form a strategy. The gate that had blocked him for so long was intimidating, but the more he studied it, the more he realized that it wasn't as strong as it appeared. The boards were slightly uneven, nails were loosely hammered, and there were gaps that could be exploited. It was clear that the HOA had designed the gate more to scare than to actually keep him out. He spent days walking around the perimeter, making mental notes of everything. Where the gaps were largest, where the shadows fell in the evening, and where no one seemed to be watching. He even noticed a few moments when the HOA representatives were distracted, talking to each other or checking their phones. Each small observation gave him a better understanding of the situation and boosted his confidence that a solution was possible. At the same time, he continued documenting every moment. Photos, videos, notes. It all added up to a clear record of what was happening. This documentation was not just for potential legal purposes. It was also a way for him to maintain clarity and control. Each time he reviewed the footage or photos, he saw not just the obstruction, but also the possibilities. He began sketching simple maps of the land, marking weak points and planning safe paths. While he worked on understanding the physical layout, he also thought about the psychological side. The HOA relied on fear and surprise, hoping that their sudden action would cause him to panic or make a mistake. But he refused to let them manipulate him. He reminded himself daily that his goal was not to confront anyone recklessly, but to reclaim access calmly and intelligently. The more he controlled his emotions, the more control he had over the situation. Neighbors had started noticing his persistence. A few came forward, quietly offering small pieces of information, observations about HOA routines, hints about who was usually on duty, and even advice on the best times to approach the property. None of them suggested doing anything illegal, They simply helped him understand the environment better. These small acts of support made him feel less isolated and reinforced the idea that careful planning was the way forward. He also began reflecting on what had happened. The gate was more than a physical obstacle. It was a symbol of unnecessary authority, a test of patience and resourcefulness. Each day that he studied it and planned his next move strengthened his resolve. He realized that the true challenge was not just reclaiming his land, but maintaining his composure and thinking clearly in a frustrating situation. The experience was teaching him resilience and strategic thinking in ways he had never imagined. One evening, as the sun was setting, he noticed something unusual. The shadows fell differently across the gate, revealing a small gap near one corner that had not been visible before. It was subtle, almost hidden, but it was enough to spark an idea. This gap could provide a path to move through the gate without damaging it or alerting the HOA unnecessarily. It was a small opportunity, but sometimes, small opportunities led to the greatest successes. He spent the next few days monitoring that corner closely. Timing was crucial. He watched for the moments when the gate was unattended or when the HOA representatives were distracted. Each observation allowed him to refine his plan, considering every variable carefully. Safety and caution were priorities. He did not want to risk confrontation or cause damage. His goal was to regain access efficiently and peacefully. During this period, he also focused on mental preparation. The anticipation of reclaiming his land was exciting, but he knew it could also make him impatient. He practiced patience, reminding himself that careful planning would pay off far more than rushing. He visualized the steps he would take, rehearsing in his mind how he would move, when he would act, and how he would handle any unexpected situations. This mental preparation strengthened his confidence. As he studied the gate and the surrounding area, he began to see patterns in the HOA's behavior. They arrived at predictable times, sometimes leaving the property unattended for long stretches. They seemed more concerned with appearances than actually preventing access. This understanding gave him more assurance that his plan could succeed without confrontation. The key was observation, timing, and subtlety. He also spent time thinking about the bigger picture. The gate was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity to demonstrate patience, intelligence, and resilience. It was a reminder that sometimes obstacles were more about perception than reality. By approaching the situation calmly and strategically, he could reclaim his property and, in the process, prove that determination and careful planning could overcome intimidation. Neighbors who had been quietly supportive continued to provide small insights. They warned him of times when the HOA might notice unusual activity and suggested safe ways to monitor the area without being observed. Their guidance was invaluable, and he appreciated their quiet encouragement. It reminded him that he was not entirely alone and that community support, even subtle, could make a difference. Finally, after days of observation, documentation, and careful planning, he felt ready. He had mapped the gate, identified the weak points, studied the routines, and mentally rehearsed every step. He knew that action was coming soon, and he felt a mixture of anticipation and determination. This was not about confrontation or proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully his in a calm, intelligent manner. The realization that the gate was more theatrical than functional brought a sense of relief. The obstacle was significant, yes, but it was not invincible. By understanding it, observing carefully, and planning strategically, he could reclaim his land without unnecessary risk. The experience had been challenging, but it had also strengthened his resolve, sharpened his observation skills, and taught him the value of patience and careful planning. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, he stood near the perimeter, looking at the gate and imagining the next steps. The anticipation was strong, but so was the confidence that his plan would work. He knew that reclaiming his land required more than courage. It required strategy, timing, and understanding, and he was ready. The next move would be decisive, and the surprise waiting beyond the fake gate would finally be revealed. Finally, the day came when he felt ready to act. The anticipation had been building for weeks, but he knew that patience and careful planning were essential. The observations, notes, and mental rehearsals all pointed to one thing. He could reclaim access to his land, and he would do it calmly, strategically, and safely. He approached the gate cautiously, moving quietly along the perimeter. The evening light cast long shadows, helping to conceal his movements. He had memorized the pattern of the HOA representatives, knowing when they were likely to be distracted or away from the area. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated. He reminded himself that the goal was not confrontation, but reclaiming what was rightfully his. As he reached the corner where he had noticed the small gap days before, his heart raced, but he focused on keeping his movements steady and calm. The gap was just as he had observed, small but sufficient. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, feeling a mix of tension and excitement. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the culmination of days of careful planning and observation. He slipped through the gap with ease, careful not to damage the gate or make any noise. On the other side, the land opened up, familiar and welcoming. It felt like stepping into a sanctuary that had been momentarily taken from him. The gate had looked formidable from the outside, but now he realized how much of the intimidation was just for show. It was a relief, but it also reinforced how unnecessary the obstruction had been. He moved slowly, taking in the surroundings. Everything was as he had left it. His small garden, the paths he had built, the trees planted over the years. The land had not changed, and the sense of ownership and connection returned immediately. It was a reminder that no artificial barrier, no matter how imposing, could take away the bond he had with his property. As he explored, he noticed the makeshift nature of the HOA's setup behind the gate. Loose boards, hastily painted signs, and even a small empty office space that seemed more theatrical than functional. The effort to intimidate had been elaborate in appearance but fragile in reality. It was almost comical, but he chose to focus on the opportunity rather than amusement. The lesson was clear: appearances could be deceiving, and confidence often outshines fear. He walked around his property, checking everything, making sure no damage had occurred during the time the gate had blocked access. The land was intact and the sense of peace slowly returned. This was not just a physical victory, but an emotional one. The weeks of frustration and careful planning had culminated in reclaiming his space without confrontation or conflict. It was a triumph of patience, intelligence, and persistence. While exploring, he found small signs that the HOA had not anticipated his awareness. Surveillance cameras were positioned poorly, boards were loosely nailed, and some areas had been neglected entirely. These oversights confirmed that the gate was more about creating a perception of control than actually enforcing it. Recognizing this reinforced his confidence that his approach had been effective and that careful observation had been key to his success. He also reflected on the lessons learned from the neighbors' subtle assistance. Quiet guidance, shared observations, and gentle encouragement had made a difference. Even without direct involvement, their support had helped him refine his plan and maintain confidence. This reinforced the idea that community, even in small ways, can play a role in overcoming challenges. The experience also gave him a new perspective on patience and resilience. The obstacle had seemed overwhelming initially, but methodical observation, planning, and calm execution had turned the situation around. Frustration had been transformed into strategic thinking, and anxiety into careful action. It was a reminder that challenges, when faced thoughtfully, could strengthen both skills and character. He spent some time reinforcing his property, ensuring that access would remain secure and that future attempts to block it would be more difficult. It was a practical step, but also symbolic, a way to assert control and protect the sanctuary that had been threatened. By taking proactive measures, he ensured that the land would remain his, free from unnecessary interference. The sun was setting, painting the sky with warm colors, and he paused to take it all in. The journey had been challenging, filled with tension, planning, and careful observation. But the outcome was deeply satisfying. He had reclaimed access to his land, maintained his composure, and demonstrated that patience, intelligence, and determination could overcome intimidation. In the quiet of the evening, he reflected on the broader lessons. The gate had been more about fear than function. Authority could overstep and appearances could be deceiving. By approaching the challenge calmly and strategically, he had turned a difficult situation into a demonstration of resilience and thoughtful action. It was a victory not just for access to property, but for patience, courage, and intelligence. Finally, he allowed himself a small smile, acknowledging the relief, the sense of triumph, and the restored connection to his land. The weeks of observation, planning, and careful action had paid off. The fake gate had been bypassed, the obstacle overcome, and the peace of his sanctuary restored. This moment marked a turning point, a moment of quiet satisfaction and a reminder that determination and thoughtful action could overcome even the most intimidating challenges. With access finally restored, he took time to walk around his property, breathing in the familiar sense of earth and plants. The garden he had tended for years was untouched, the paths he had built still clearly visible, and the trees he had planted had grown stronger than ever. It was a comforting reminder that his land had endured, and the artificial obstacle of the HOA gate could not change that. Every step he took was a small celebration of patience, resilience, and perseverance. He reflected on the journey that had led to this moment. Weeks of observation, documentation, careful planning, and emotional control had culminated in reclaiming what was rightfully his. The experience had been exhausting, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately empowering. It had taught him the value of strategic thinking, the importance of patience, and the power of maintaining composure under pressure. Neighbors who had watched from a distance now approached with smiles and quiet admiration. Some apologized for not being able to help sooner, while others simply expressed relief that the situation was resolved. These interactions reminded him that community, even when silent or cautious, could offer support in subtle but meaningful ways. The experience had strengthened connections and fostered a sense of shared understanding that went beyond words. He decided to take proactive steps to ensure that such an obstacle would not arise again. While the gate had been more symbolic than functional, he reinforced his property, making it clear that any future attempts at intimidation would not succeed. Small adjustments to the fence, careful placement of surveillance cameras, and clear signage were all part of a plan to protect his land while maintaining respect for neighbors and the HOA. It was a practical measure, but also a symbolic one, asserting his ownership and readiness without confrontation. During this time, he also reflected on the broader lessons learned from the ordeal. The gate had been a test of patience, observation, and resilience. The HOA had relied on fear and appearances, hoping to intimidate him into compliance, but by approaching the situation thoughtfully and strategically, he had turned the challenge into a demonstration of intelligence, careful planning, and quiet strength. It was a reminder that obstacles, no matter how imposing they seem, can be overcome with patience and determination. He spent a day walking through the property, taking note of areas that might need maintenance, and enjoying the simple pleasures of the land he loved. The garden required tending. The paths needed clearing, and the trees could use some care, but these tasks felt restorative rather than burdensome. Reconnecting with the land on his own terms was a powerful affirmation of control, independence, and peace. The emotional weight of the experience began to lift. The tension, frustration, and anticipation that had marked the past weeks gradually gave way to a sense of calm and accomplishment. He realized that the conflict had taught him more about patience, strategy, and resilience than he had imagined. It had been an unwelcome challenge, but it had strengthened his sense of self and his ability to face future obstacles thoughtfully. He also took time to consider the human aspect of the situation. The HOA representatives had acted out of a sense of authority and perhaps personal judgment, but their efforts had been more about perception than reality. Recognizing this helped him understand the dynamics of control, fear, and power, and reinforced the importance of responding with intelligence rather than emotion. It was a lesson not just about property, but about life and human behavior. Neighbors continued to share small observations and encouragement, creating a quiet sense of solidarity. The subtle support had been invaluable, helping him navigate the situation with confidence and clarity. Even though they had not directly intervened, their presence and understanding contributed to the eventual resolution. It was a reminder that community, even when understated, can make a meaningful difference. He spent the next few days reinforcing routines on the property. Regular walks, careful monitoring, and thoughtful maintenance ensured that the land remained secure and welcoming. The garden was tended, paths cleared, and minor repairs completed. Each action reinforced his connection to the property and his control over it. The sense of empowerment that came from being able to care for the land without obstruction was deeply satisfying. The experience had also shifted his perspective on conflict. The gate had been an obstacle, yes, but it had also been an opportunity to practice patience, strategy, and composure. By observing carefully, planning thoughtfully, and acting calmly, he had turned a tense situation into a demonstration of quiet strength and resilience. The lessons learned would carry forward into other aspects of life, reminding him that intelligence and patience often outshine force and intimidation. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch, watching the sun set over his property. The soft colors of the sky, the sounds of the garden, and the gentle rustle of leaves reminded him of why he had chosen this land in the first place. It was more than a physical space. It was a sanctuary, a place of peace and reflection, and now a symbol of perseverance and triumph. Each evening became a moment of gratitude, reflection, and quiet celebration. The HOA gate, once a source of stress and frustration, now seemed almost insignificant. It had been a challenge, yes, but it had also been a test of patience, observation, and careful planning. By approaching the situation thoughtfully, he had reclaimed his land, his peace of mind, and his sense of control. The experience reinforced the importance of resilience, intelligence, and the quiet strength that comes from facing obstacles calmly and strategically. In the end, he understood that the true victory was not just in regaining access to the property, but in the personal growth that had come from the experience. Patience, careful observation, strategic thinking, and composure had guided him through the challenge. The land was restored, his connection to it strengthened, and his sense of confidence renewed. The journey had been difficult, but the outcome was profoundly satisfying. As the days went on, he continued to enjoy the simple pleasures of his property, maintaining it with care and attention. The garden flourished, the paths remained clear, and the trees grew stronger. The land was a living testament to patience, perseverance, and thoughtful action. The HOA gate, once a symbol of intimidation, had become a reminder of the power of careful planning, observation, and resilience. Finally, he allowed himself to fully relax, appreciating the restored peace and the lessons learned. The experience had been a journey, challenging and enlightening. He had faced frustration, uncertainty, and fear, but through observation, planning, and patience, he had emerged victorious. The land was his once more, a sanctuary of calm and satisfaction, and a testament to the power of resilience and thoughtful action.